It seems like human trafficking is everywhere these days. Every time I open social media, there's another awful story. It's really getting to me, to be honest.
It's heavy stuff, no question. But that's exactly why we're tackling it in this deep dive. Today we're going to, really unpack the link between foster care and human trafficking here in the
Right,
US.
foster care, a system that should be protecting kids. And instead, we see these horrifying connections to trafficking. It's tough to even think about, honestly.
It really is. And to be precise, we're zeroing in on CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation of children.
Right, we need to be clear about what we're talking about, yeah.
Absolutely. And the CSEC statistics are they're alarming, to say the least. The National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse estimates that something like 300,000 to 400,000 children are exploited every year in the U.S. alone.
Oh, wow, that number is just... I mean, it's hard to even fathom that many children. And the fact that we're working with academic papers, advocacy group reports, and even like YouTube testimonies for this deep dive, it tells me this problem is way bigger than most people realize, you know?
It's a huge crisis hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
And the sources you've gathered really do paint a bleak picture, especially an unholy alliance report.
An unholy alliance. Yeah, that one really stayed with me for sure. It shows that a shocking percentage of kids trafficked for sex were previously in the foster care system, like half of them in California and 85% in New York. Those are huge numbers. It's awful.
Yeah, and it gets worse. That same report cites a study that found 98% of child sex trafficking survivors they identified had been involved with child welfare services at some point. So it's not just a regional problem, it's clearly systemic.
So we're talking about a system that's failing to protect. I mean, it's failing to protect the kids who need it most. But why? What makes kids in foster care such easy targets for these traffickers?
Well, an unholy alliance gets into that. They talk about this perfect storm of vulnerabilities. These kids are often dealing with intense trauma. I mean, even before they enter the system.
Wow, so they're already carrying so much.
Yeah.
And that makes them more susceptible to manipulation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what do the sources say about the types of trauma these kids are facing?
Well, one study cited in an unholy alliance found that a significant portion of these children had a history of sexual abuse. So these are kids carrying deep, deep emotional scars. And they crave love and stability, acceptance, and, traffickers are ready and waiting to exploit that.
It just breaks my heart, this basic human need for connection, for love. It becomes this horrible vulnerability that predators can prey on.
That's exactly right. And this is made even worse by how unstable the foster care system can be. Moving from home to home, often with little to no warning, it makes it almost impossible for these kids to form healthy attachments and trust.
And that lack of stability has terrible consequences. An unholy alliance actually cites some statistics on this we get. Second national incidence studies of missing, abducted, runaway, and thrown away children. It found that over 6,000 foster youth run away every year. And a tragic number who do come back report engaging in survival sex while they were on the streets.
It's a heartbreaking cycle. They run from an unstable environment only to face even more exploitation and danger. That constant uprooting, it takes a toll. It leaves them feeling lost and alone and desperate for any connection.
God, it's like the system that's supposed to protect them. It's actually pushing them into the dangers it should prevent.
Sadly, that's often the case. And it's not just running away either. When these kids age out of the system at 18, many are totally on their own with very little support.
And that's a terrifying thought for anyone, but especially for someone who's already been through so much. I mean, an unholy alliance states that 22% end up homeless.
Which makes them incredibly vulnerable to traffickers, right?
Exactly. They offer them a place to stay, maybe the illusion of a family. And that's exactly what makes Allie Carter's story so important, and we'll get into that more later.
Right, Allie's YouTube testimony, it gives a first-hand account of how these vulnerabilities can be exploited. Her story gives a human face to these horrifying statistics.
It does, and it also sheds light on the tactics these traffickers use.
Allie was only 15 when she was taken to this party, this Diddy party. But it wasn't a normal party. She describes it as an assault party, where she was treated like a commodity, basically.
And she was under the care of Riverside County Child Protective Services at the time. It's chilling how easily traffickers can infiltrate these spaces.
It really is. And the things she describes from that night are horrifying. The carnival-like atmosphere that became something dark and disturbing. She even mentioned this wheel that guests would be strapped to and spun around. And then, well, it's just awful. I don't even want to repeat it here. It's hard to imagine what she went through.
It really is beyond horrific. And one of the most tragic things about her story is how she talks about shutting down, like dissociating to cope with the trauma.
It's awful. And it's a reminder that behind the numbers, behind all the headlines, are real children suffering through these unimaginable things.
And that trauma leaves scars. The fear, the shame, the guilt, it can be paralyzing. Makes it even harder to come forward.
Which is why Allie's story and her bravery in sharing it is so powerful.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But it also shows how urgently we need change.
Okay, so let's talk about the perpetrators for a second. Who are these people who prey on these vulnerable children? What does an unholy alliance tell us about them?
One of the most striking things the report found was that a significant percentage, 24% of the traffickers they looked at, were themselves in foster care as children.
Oh, wow. Talk about a vicious cycle. It's like they're replicating the trauma they endured.
You got it. It really highlights how damaging childhood trauma can be and how it can manifest in destructive ways later in life. The report found that most of the farmer traffickers they interviewed had experienced violence in their homes or foster placements, and 80% had been sexually abused as kids.
God, that's just heartbreaking. It's like this awful cycle of abuse that just keeps going.
Mm-hmm.
And while we can't condone their actions, understanding this cycle might be key to breaking it. But we also need to know how they operate, right? What are they doing? What are the tactics they're using to lure these kids in?
Well, an unholy alliance outlined some disturbingly common ones. One that stood out was the boyfriend technique.
Boyfriend technique sounds so manipulative. I mean, it sounds almost innocent, but for someone who's desperate for that love and stability, I can't imagine.
It's predatory grooming, plain and simple, showering the victim with attention, affection, all fake, of course. They build up this trust, sometimes over a long period, and then they exploit it in the worst way.
It's awful. Manipulating something so fundamental as human connection. And then there's the other side of it, like an unholy alliance describes. The guerrilla technique. Equally terrifying, but in such a different way.
Yeah, that's about brute force abduction. It shows you the real danger these kids are in. They're not just vulnerable to manipulation, they're in physical danger too.
God, it's like you're caught between a predator who wants to earn your trust and one who'll just take you by force. There's no good outcome there.
And both are effective, tragically. And we can't forget about technology either.
Right. We touched on the internet and social media before.
It's a hunting ground now. An unholy alliance talks about how traffickers are online, in chat rooms, on social media, even gaming communities.
And it's easy to forget kids in foster care, especially if they've moved around a lot. They might not have the same guidance when it comes to online safety.
You're absolutely right. They might be online looking for connection, attention even, and that makes them even more vulnerable to being manipulated. And even for kids who are usually pretty savvy online, these traffickers can be really good at what they do. They create fake profiles, lie about who they are, use flattery, they might give gifts, even threaten the kids, all to groom them.
And it's not always adults preying on them either, is it? An unholy alliance mentions something called peer recruiting.
Yeah, that's where traffickers use other kids to recruit victims from foster care or group homes. They often exploit those existing insecurities, luring them in with promises of money, drugs, sometimes even just a sense of belonging.
It's just awful that anyone, adult or child, could knowingly exploit someone like that. It feels especially cruel. It makes you wonder what kind of support exists for these kids. Who's looking out for them once they're caught in this web of exploitation?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, it's a tough one to answer. There are people and organizations doing great work, but the systems in place, the ones meant to protect these kids, they're often the ones failing them.
God, that's terrifying. We've talked about the problem a lot, but I'm starting to feel powerless here. Like, what can we even do? This problem is so systemic, so huge. Where do we even start?
It's understandable to feel overwhelmed. This is heavy stuff. But I think an unholy alliance offers some hope here. They highlight several things individuals can do to make a difference.
Okay, so what can our listeners do? Give me the action items. I'm ready.
First and foremost, awareness is key. This problem thrives in the shadows. Talking about it, sharing this information, that's huge.
Right, breaking the silence, even when it's hard. What about more direct action? What can we do to help these kids specifically?
Supporting organizations that are actively fighting human trafficking is so important. They're the ones on the ground, providing services, advocating for change.
Do you have any recommendations? Organizations our listeners could look into?
The best thing to do is research local groups in your area. There's some amazing people doing incredible work right in our communities.
Right. Local organizations are usually the best way to go. They understand the needs of their communities better than anyone. But besides supporting those organizations, what can we do as individuals? I'm not a social worker. I don't work with law enforcement. So how can I actually help make a difference?
It's easy to feel powerless, I get it. But an unholy alliance stresses something really important, just being observant in our daily lives.
Okay, so what does that look like?
It starts with paying attention to the kids around us, especially the ones who seem more vulnerable, you know?
Okay.
Are they withdrawn, anxious? Do they seem scared, like they're walking on eggshells all the time?
Right. Those could all be signs that something's wrong, things you might not notice if you weren't looking for them.
Exactly. And inconsistencies, too, like do they have expensive things they can't explain? Gifts, money. Are they being secretive about what they're doing online? Phone calls, who they're hanging out with, that kind of thing.
Those are all pretty big red flags.
Exactly. And that's where those tough conversations come in. If something seems off, don't ignore it. Say something. You might be the only one who does. And that could make all the difference for that child.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. It really drives home that we all have a part to play in protecting kids. But having those conversations can be hard. Who should we be talking to?
If you think a child is in immediate danger, call the authorities right away, obviously. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a great resource, too. But you can also reach out to other adults in that child's life, teachers, counselors, family friends, anyone who could help.
Creating that safety net, that community of support, that's so important. Predators thrive when they can operate in silence and isolation.
Exactly. Shining a light on these tactics is the first step.
Allie Carter's story really highlights that need. The need for awareness, for action, for justice. Her story will stay with me for a long time.
Mine, too. It's incredibly brave of her to come forward. She's giving a voice to the voiceless and reminding us that behind the statistics, behind these horrific crimes, are real children whose lives have been forever changed.
We can't ever forget that. It's a heavy reminder of the human cost of this issue. But it's also a call to action, isn't it?
It absolutely is. We can't just stand by and do nothing. Every child deserves to be safe, to be free from exploitation. And it's up to all of us to make that happen.
Well said. To our listeners out there, we challenge you to learn more. Support organizations fighting this. Be observant in your communities. Don't be afraid to have those tough conversations. Even small actions can make a world of difference.
That's right. Your voice matters. Your compassion matters. Never underestimate how powerful that can be.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Thank you so much for guiding us through this. It's been really insightful.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, awareness is the first step. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for these kids.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. But like we always say, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep the conversation going, and we'll see you next time.